Alban, please tell people a little bit about the River Don project and some of the thinking that's led to the project.
Wonderful. No, thank you, Simon, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation as well. I'm just going to share the screen and hopefully it will go well. And as I'm doing that, I'm now forgetting where I've got it shared. So let me try. Okay. And then how does that come across?
That's perfect.
Okay, wonderful. I actually do agree with not only Shurish and his presentation and the way that they're all woven into one another. And the reason that I do, so before I go into the River Dawn project, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about, I wanted to highlight how important that these movements and our connection to nature and our connection to water and understanding of the problems actually require a micro, meso, macro approach. And then within that, we need a meta understanding, in essence, as to what the real problem is, so then we can find solutions that fit within that. So I'm going to actually do a little bit of explanation on our understanding of the River Don project, and then you can start to understand how and why we've approached it in the way that we do. So that actually takes a lot of good work from Paul and Lois for Nature, from Erica at the Don Catchment Rivers Trust, and also a further macro sort of aspect to it. Not that we're quite at that level and doing that wonderful work as of yet, but we shall wait. At the River Don project, we're trying to model the future rights of nature in South Yorkshire. And at Opus, we work to create and support responses to achieve urgent systems change. And we do this by telling stories, bringing people together, and demonstrating alternatives. And I promise I'm not going to read from the slides on every particular one. And the first slide I want to go in is collective intelligence systems. And I've used a beautiful painting from Greece, one of the bedrocks or foundation of modern democracy, to actually highlight a criticism of that. So the way that we see collective intelligence systems, like democracy, for example, we recognize that within there are limitations. And furthermore, it's also malleable, so it can change for the worse and for the better. So we have to be cognizant of that. Another collective intelligence system is a market, funnily enough. And one of the critiques of that is even though it's incredibly efficient to add value to a particular commodity, we question the value that's added. So, in essence, a dead tree is worth a lot more than a live tree because we value the wood a lot more than we understand how it supports our ecosystem. So maybe actually, as similar to what Paul was saying, we need to explore our relationship and our value systems before we start to look at narrow boundary or small solutions that are well placed, well meaning, and do excellent work, but are really attaching and approaching the symptoms of a particular problem. And that's not to say that we have all the answers. It's just to state that we're exploring it from this meta frame. So this is a very fun and helpful visual in the sense that we'll be exploring three crises or frames of crises: a meta crisis, a polycrisis, and a permacrisis. And what we'll be highlighting is how actually these three combined create a self-terminating system, which does sound bleak because it is. And here is a visual representation of that self-terminating system. So this visual is from the Stockholm Resilience Centre. And I believe it was last updated in 2023, if I'm not mistaken, in September. And it shows how we're 6 out of 9 of the planetary boundaries. And that's terrifying. And there is such brilliant work at a local, regional, national, international level. But what we also want to ask is that targeted in the right way? Do we actually need to completely shift our ontology or our way of being to look at this problem with the magnitude that is required? So first, I'll do a very brief explanation on a permacrisis. And this is something that we refer to as compounding. And I'll do this by giving you an example, an example. So we are used to the phrase a once in a generation flood. The issue with that is that once it occurs in that generation, the likelihood, because of those planetary boundaries limitations, is that it will next occur twice or three times. An example here in Sheffield, it's been the coldest, I think, in the start of September, one of the coldest Septembers ever on record. Our ability to respond to that once in a generation flood, to that hottest summer that we're experiencing, or that coldest autumn, is actually closing. Our ability to build resilience into our responses is actually being limited. So the longer that we leave a particular solution or a larger solution at hand, the worse that this will become, and the more compounding the effects of these floods and fires, carbon emissions, etc., will actually compound. And that leads us quite nicely into, okay, so if we recognize the severity and how we need to be proactive, really, 4 decades ago, what about the complexity? And this is where it moves on to our introduction of a polycrisis. One thing that's incredibly difficult is to actually understand the complexity of the challenge that we face. So not only is it compounding, but it's also intersectional. So I'll give you a good example within a UK narrative. We have at present a housing crisis, and the conversation, as it should be, is to resolve that. The challenge is how. And the solution at present by our current Labour government is that we need to build more homes, which within a common sense conversation sounds brilliant. So, okay, we have a limited stock of housing, therefore we need more. The challenge to that is actually when we look at our carbon emissions and when we look at the Paris Agreement that we've signed up to, and when we look at how climate breakdown is occurring around us, is the situation of more emissions going to help that different issue? And this is what we refer to as intersectional. We are incredibly good at looking at a problem and finding a narrow solution. We have a shortage of homes, we build more housing. What we actually need to do is take a step back and recognize that this in of itself is only but one within a sequence of a multitude of issues. And actually, we need to sense into that complexity and start to have honest conversations, not about leaving people in destitute or in poverty, but about maybe even questioning ourselves and our requirements and our needs for the current policies that we have, and maybe looking at how we can unlock capacity in a different way to sit within those limits. Finally, I'm going to do a brief introduction to a meta crisis. So again, this is as a combination with the other two. So if we have a understanding as a society, and we have an extractive logic, so that being that we need to extract from nature, we see it as a resource, as an asset. We see it as something that has value once extracted. If we also have unaligned exponential technology, so in short, that's essentially suggesting that the technology that we build is purposeful in its rate of extraction or for extraction. And it's built not in essence to provide complex solutions, but to look at the narrow goals that we've already set. And then actually a touch to that as well, the rivalrous dynamics. So here's a great example. If we don't fish in that sea, then another state will. If we don't exploit and extract from that sea, then another state will. So we have to be first, and we have to do it the best, and we have to extract it at a rate where we outstrip our competition. And in economic terms, or in other terms, that's usually referred to as game theory, where you're consistently looking at the individual across the table as a competitor, not as a collaborator, not as an ally. And we see that, obviously, and we have seen that, and we will continue to see that. So actually, when we have this mindset, this meta frame, coupled with our inability to sense into that complexity, coupled with the issue that our resilience and ability to build resilience is actually becoming more limited, it doesn't look particularly good. And I'll show a really good visual from the Donut Economics Lab, and they're doing incredible work And what this is highlighting in the sense, okay, so we have our biosphere limitations at the top, because we don't live in an infinite planet with infinite resources. And at the core, we also have our social foundations. So we really need to have a conversation as communities in stating that actually for us all to achieve these social foundations in a way that limits the impact to our biosphere, we need to really reconstruct or deconstruct our current understanding, framing, and narratives. Um, and that's going to be a really difficult conversation. I mean, even at this moment, as we continue to exceed those planetary boundaries, as we continue to asset strip the planet, those social foundations are still not being met. And that's in the UK, where they started that excessive stripping a very long time ago. Never mind when we communicate at an international level. And I don't think that we're necessarily having those conversations. So this brings us back to the River Don project, and I'll try and keep it short because I know that I'll be running out of time. We aren't the solution, but we're trying to ask the right questions. And we're working with people who also have their own interpretations, their own specialisms, and motivations. And we're trying to do that together. So as you can see here, we've got partners from both universities in Sheffield, the Sustainability Centre, Sheffield Data for Good, and also Hive IT, Don Catchment Rivers Trust, and Lawyers for Nature as well, and That Matter Labs. And we're trying to create a demonstrator project. So we're recognizing this framing, and we're saying, okay, so what is a solution? We don't necessarily know that solution, but we can try to demonstrate one. And through demonstrating a particular project, we can start to see what does work, what doesn't work, what needs to be revalued, and also what's specific to that context. Because not everything that will work in Sheffield or South Yorkshire will work further in Wales or Scotland, for example, or even in Cambridgeshire. And our mission statement is to not only do that exploration, but attempt to be innovative in our modelling and demonstration for the future rights of nature. So certain elements of this would look at AI-informed self-sovereign agent entity. And that's an interesting one because it sounds ludicrous to an extent, but I'll explain a little bit later how that could look like. Looking at how we have an engagement platform, looking at how we have a relational accounting, care tokens, stewardship innovation, and having actual contracts with nature. So, taking it away from the 18th or 19th century social contracts and actually trying to do something for the 21st century. I'll skip over a little bit because I've already mentioned who we are, and I'll just briefly touch upon the governance structure. So at the core of our project, not only within our criticisms of the meta frame, we're also criticizing the way that we operate. We want to create a contracting structure for ourselves and our partners that's not one-to-one. So it's not that we provide a service, it's not that nature provides a service to us. And it's not a one-to-many as an institution would have with multiple clients. It's a many-to-many. So we have a mission statement at the core, and all our partners enter that mission statement as partners. And they have their own assets to bring, and they have their own risks to share. And we try and collaborate around that. But fundamentally, it's the mission statement that we're attempting to achieve. And this is a brief visual on the group collective that we have. So we have a collective governance group, a steering group, and project holders, or as we are currently calling it, working groups. Now, I won't speak too much to all of these, but I'll try and briefly sort of highlight how within the strategic aims, apologies. At first, we want to be multidisciplinary. We are not experts. We have particular backgrounds within Opus Independence and within the River Don project, but we rely on people like Erica of Don Catchment Rivers Trust. We rely on people like Paul at Lawyers for Nature to bring their level of experience and expertise to critique us and for us together to understand and try and sense into that complexity. We're also trying to develop an AI interface, an interface for care within an engagement platform. Now that in of itself isn't a solution, but is actually quite playful, and I'll explain that in a moment. We're also exploring how you can do a community movement, how you can look at a river rights declaration and stewardship agreement. So really with this, we're taking a lot of learning what's happening across the country and also across the globe. and we're trying to apply it within its context within South Yorkshire and the UK in particular. And we also want to co-create a river rights declaration, potentially into a bylaw proposal or equivalent, to see if we can move the horizon to the next step, where we can build a foundation within the current mechanisms to try and conceptualize something that we could never have imagined unless we have that building block. And finally, as complex as this does sound, we're trying to deploy a multi-agent legal, economic, stewardship, and governance frameworks. So the governance frameworks is what I've spoken to with amending to many governance. The stewardship contracting is, again, in the realm of rights of nature. Economic is potentially the tokenization of how we interact with nature. A multi-agent is actually in the premise of a route to recognize nature as an active agent in its participation with us. So it's not something that's passive. It's not something that has things done to it. It is actually an active member within that relationship. And these working groups, I'll speak to a little bit in a sense of, so the arts and culture narrative is, how do we tell stories? How do we change narratives? How do we look at something that's quite abstract like rights of nature and bring it into the everyday? The research is quite heavy in its academia and an understanding of, okay, so if you were to unlock rights of nature, for example, if you want to unlock a new relationship with water, what does that mean going forward? What does that mean for the individual on a psychological level, on a physical level, for example, from a level of well-being? What does that mean to a community and its sense of care and its sense of pride? What does that mean in a sense of democracy if you were to give rights to nature? Very interesting questions that we don't necessarily have the answers to, but unless you demonstrate it and attempt it, you're never going to essentially find out. Next is legal, which Paul has spoken to an extent, but also something that needs to be explored and is being explored in very different ways, which is quite exciting at the moment. They funnel within the community and engagement, and that platform in of itself that we're creating is a part of a technology piece, and the technology piece is not the solution, but it's something that can help as a tool within this journey. So in brief, our technology group at this moment is looking at an engagement platform that we have created, where we have stored secondary data that's publicly available, with the hope of introducing primary data there from water sensors, air quality sensors, and also precipitation radar. And then you can start to, with that data, model the consequences to our actions in real time. Furthermore, that platform allows the individual to contribute their data. It could be a photo, a poem of care, for example. It could be even an opportunity where you see an invasive species or a particular wildlife, and then it's constructed and held on one piece of software. And what I really like about that, and this is where I was referring to it within the AI, if you have a chatbot that's got access to that API, it can then communicate its data to you as a representative of a river. Now, again, that's incredibly playful, and we know that we're not obviously doing a direct personification of a waterway, but what we're trying to do is to be very playful in our way that we approach it. So actually, the river or the water does communicate. We just can't listen to it. We can't quite understand it. And the way that we can understand it at present is to gather the right data sets to understand what its health is. So if we have a particular water sensor and it flags that its turbidity has increased, that flag will be put onto the platform. So anybody who's walking along that area that's signed up onto that platform will get a notification saying that the river has seen an increase in its turbidity. Would you be able to take a photo? And right there, you can enter into a contract with something that is usually seen as a separate, something that's usually seen as an asset rather than an agent or an actant in its relationship. And we feel, again, not that necessarily that is the solution in the long term, but it's definitely something that revisits our relationship with nature and something that brings to the forefront all the complexities of the reality that's occurring in the background. That only when you take a moment to, a moment in silence, that you start to admire just how complex everything around us is. I do have our sort of ideal version by 2026, but I don't think I will necessarily have the time to go through it And this presentation will be shared. And I also have notes at the bottom if you want to proceed with sort of your own journey and exploration. And this is a point on the kind of questions you can ask as we start to demonstrate this alternative reality. But I just wanted to leave with this particular quote from Civic Square, is that we are the first generation to know the scale of the challenges that have been created by human activity on the planet, and we are one of the last that can deeply do something about it. And we believe that it is now about how we collectively harness that, working boldly enough whilst being legitimate enough and doing so with care, demonstrate systematically, work in the colleges and with a thoughtful urgency. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. And please do visit our website and please do email me if you've got any questions.
That was great, Alban. Thank you so much.